Well, thank you very much, Pastor Billy. Now, some of you may be a little disappointed already that you're having to suffer a sermon by me, but now you know that the content is about suffering, then that's a double whammy. But seriously, suffering is something that is worthy of our consideration, not because we're masochists, not because we glory in it, not because we're supposed to enjoy it, but because it's there. And the suffering that I want to talk about this morning is suffering that affects all of us as Christians or those of us who don't have a relationship with Jesus as yet. That might be sickness, it might be financial problems, it might be emotional trauma, it might be spiritual darkness and confusion, it might be mental difficulties. The whole range of suffering is what I want to encompass in our time together. It's, for some of us, temporary. For others of us, it's enduring. Some of us seem to live in lives that are just constant trauma, challenge after challenge after challenge. Some of our suffering is relieved through prayer. Some of it is removed through prayer. Some of it, despite the fact that we pray for a long time, still stays. And that sometimes is the most difficult challenge, especially if we come from a Pentecostal or a charismatic tradition, because it leaves with us the uncertainty as to whether it's right for us to be suffering. Because one of the tragic legacies of our traditioning, sometimes as Pentecostals, I speak as a Pentecostal, is that suffering is viewed as work of the devil, or exists in our lives because we don't pray enough for it to be removed, or because we don't have enough faith to present to God, as a result of which it will be removed, and yet the suffering still stays, and we're left uncertain. And I want us to have a look to see what the New Testament in particular has to say about this topic. But that just does remind me that there are some resources at the back, because I suspect I won't be able to say all that I want to say on suffering, and there is at least one book there that's on healing and suffering. Because both of them are gifts. Both of them are gifts that God gives to us. You might think it's healing that's the gift that God gives to us, and suffering is something that doesn't come from God. It's not the message of the Bible. Both of them are gifts, and that book will explore what the New Testament in particular has to say. There are other resources there which mainly explore the person of the Father and the Son and the Spirit, and I just brought this one with me because this has just come back into print, and it's a very easy read exploring who our great God is. It's one of my favorite books that I wrote many years ago, and it was written because my wife Judy said, we don't get enough sermons about God. And that made me think, well, how many books are there about God? And there are heavy theological tomes, but not many that are readable by ordinary people like you and me. So I thought I would write one. But there are other resources there, and Pastor Billy has already mentioned them, the resources that are dedicated to cell groups or personal devotions. Somebody already wants to buy one. Excellent. Coming straight to the front. Well, there are two more that came out just a couple of weeks ago, and one of them is on Ephesians, and there's a DVD that goes with it. If you're interested in having a resource to help you in your personal devotions, then check them out. Or if your cell group is needing some resources, then check them out as well. But to my talk. Let me give you some of the reasons why I think Pentecostals, but other evangelical believers, why I think we don't address this issue of suffering very much. One of the reasons is because we believe that God can supernaturally rescue us from all of our difficulties through prayer. Of course he can. And in fact, he invites us to pray and ask for his support and for him to remove some of the situations we find ourselves in. And sometimes he does remove those situations from our lives. But the notion that he always swoops down into our difficult situations and rescues us from them isn't true to reality. It certainly isn't true to the New Testament, and we need to address that, not to cling tenaciously to the belief that God will always do it and somehow forget those countless times when he doesn't. Too quickly, as Christians, we also prefer to have a theology of glory, not a theology of suffering. We prefer to think of Jesus being resurrected rather than Jesus on the cross. We prefer to think of Jesus being ascended in glory rather than Jesus suffering in Gethsemane, traumas that we cannot even begin to imagine. And that, again, is a tragic legacy if we have this traditioning that's part of our thinking, that somehow suffering is an illegitimate experience for the Christian. Somehow suffering is not a word that we should be using to describe an event in our lives. I remember some years ago when I was working at the college, a student came and asked if he could share a word of testimony in our devotions, which was when the whole college gathers together, and we said, yes, of course. And he gave his testimony, but it wasn't the kind of testimony we anticipated that he would give, because it went along these lines. I just want to let you know, I'm really struggling. I'll come through because I know that God's in charge, and he has helped me do in these times before, but right now, I'm just clinging on with my fingertips. And I don't need your prayers so much as I just want to be honest and share that with you because it's an authentic part of my journey with Jesus. Then he sat down, and we thought, well, what chorus can we sing now? There's no choruses that deal with that kind of honest portrayal of what life is sometimes, often like in our lives. And even though his words, as he shared them with us, and it wasn't for pity, he just wanted to be authentic, those words, I suspect, would have done a great deal of benefit for the members of our community, but still, there was that discomfort. Should we be saying to him, actually, don't give your testimony yet. Give the testimony when you've come through this dark time, when the wilderness is in the past, and now you're on the mountaintop. The angel has come. The answers to prayer has come. You're back. Maybe then it's the appropriate time to give a word of testimony. I'm not sure. I think from time to time to be able to share that life is difficult, that we are suffering, and it isn't because we've sinned or because God's walked away from us or because we have walked away from God or because we haven't got enough faith. That kind of testimony could be quite powerful and quite beneficial. So that's my starting point. Suffering, if I was going to give this talk a strapline, would be something like this. Suffering, it's not our enemy as Christians, and often it's good for us. I say that not because I don't know suffering in my life. I don't say it because I think it's important that we enjoy suffering, but I want to explore with you what the New Testament has to say about suffering, and that will be our basis. I'll tell some stories along the way to contextualize it. But a couple of issues that might help us address this issue more authentically. First one. Jesus, when he came to this earth, did not remove all suffering. The rather blasé perspective that we might have when we look at the Gospels is that Jesus' role was to end suffering. And the fact is that everybody who came to Jesus for healing was healed. And if demons were stupid enough to mention their presence, they were cast out by Jesus, and they never seemed to learn the lesson. And the implication, therefore, is that will be the same today, that Jesus will deal with all suffering if we bring it to him. But Jesus did not heal everybody who was ill in Israel. And there were some occasions where Jesus healed one person, and it was one person in a community who were not healed. So it isn't correct to suggest that Jesus' manifesto is to deal with all suffering. Remember that people in the first century didn't reach the age of 35. Life was nasty, it was brutish, it was hard. Suffering was what they existed in. Jesus came to make a statement that he had the authority to deal with suffering, but he didn't deal with all suffering. So, for example, slavery, which was a huge problem in the ancient world, not that most people thought of it as a problem, Jesus didn't speak about that. He didn't oppose it. He didn't speak about the subjugation of the Jewish people by the Roman authorities. He didn't speak about the rich landowner Jews who suppressed the majority of the poor people who lived in Israel. There's no reference to the crippling poverty and oppression that the Jewish people lived under as a result of the taxation. He doesn't mention about the subjugation of women that were there present in Jewish society, let alone Greco-Roman society. Now, rather than dismissing suffering with the flick of his fingers, he actually forecast suffering for his followers. Suffering is not an illegitimate experience on the part of believers. And then if you move beyond Jesus into the church that follows him and walks in his footsteps, what do we find? Well, we find that persecuted, financially impoverished, marginalized, suffering church grows because of its suffering, not despite its suffering. When you read the pages of the book of Acts, and I sometimes smile to myself when I hear people saying, let's get back to the days of the book of Acts. If only our church was functioning as it did in the book of Acts. I wonder whether they've actually read the book of Acts. Because the book of Acts explores the first person who is martyred for being a Christian. The book of Acts explores people who suffer because of their faith. The book of Acts explores those people who did something wrong in the church, and God's punishment was quite severe. Ananias and Sapphira killed because they told a lie. They got to heaven, I'm sure, they just got there a bit earlier than they'd planned. The book of Acts shows that God, the Spirit, his agenda is to lead that church to victory through a sea of suffering. The role of the Spirit in the book of Acts, indeed, throughout the New Testament, is not to associate himself with glory, with triumph, with dynamism, with cataclysmic supremacy. Often the Spirit is associated with pain, with darkness, with confusion, with doubt. And his role is to support in that time so that this suffering, weak, vulnerable church can demonstrate the great glory of God and make a difference in its community. It's a very different picture. And some of you will come from countries or contexts where suffering is very significant. If you're coming from the UK and this has been where you've spent your life, or in much of the West, then you won't know persecution. But there are plenty of churches in our world where persecution is severe, and that church is growing as a result of it. I was in India just in January working with a very large denomination there and corresponding with them in the months since, and they said, this is our challenge. We know that the government is going to make it illegal for us to share the good news of Jesus, even though we are Indian nationals, and persecution is coming, and it's going to come by 2021. That's the legislature that's on the books for the Indian government, which is currently Hindu. So what is their response? Their response is to make church planting even more a major element of their agenda, because they want the church to be ready for the persecution. They're not praying against it. They're not praying that the devil will not have his way. They are recognizing that persecution is one of the things that Jesus said would happen, and their role is to take advantage of the resources of God during that time. Just a couple of months ago, Judy and I were in Hong Kong. I was teaching there, but last year I was teaching in the same city to Christian leaders who've come from the main line or the main centers in China. And they'd come to Hong Kong for a week's teaching an academic program that I participate in. And one of the men who was there was an elderly gentleman. He didn't speak English, but his son translated for me. And he talked to me a little bit about his life, which was under the Marxist regime in those days. I think it was about 30 years he was in prison as a result of his faith in Jesus, and about 15 of those years he was in solitary confinement. And I was interested to hear his testimony, and I gently probed him, and this is the gist of what he said. A couple of things. One thing that I found interesting was that he said, I know that you in the West were praying for us, and we valued your prayers, and we understood your motivation. You didn't like to see us suffering because we were suffering inordinately. But what you didn't realize was that God was very special to us in those days. And we didn't see the suffering as you saw the suffering. You were praying against the devil, that the devil would somehow be released from that time of suffering that he was subjugating the church to, when in reality we knew that this was God's way of helping us become firm, settled, committed, and we knew that the gospel of Jesus would be developed at a much greater degree because the people would see the suffering that the Christians were undergoing. Very interesting to hear him speak like that. I've had this kind of conversation in other countries and other contexts as well. But here's the challenge for the Chinese church now, which is growing exponentially. The challenge is that it's becoming already simplistic in its theology. It's becoming thin in terms of its spirituality and its relationship with Jesus. Great numbers of people are flooding into the church, but they're very concerned that some of the traditions, some of the experiences of their forefathers are not present, and that is resulting in a church that doesn't have the depth that it's going to need when persecution returns. Persecution, even persecution, trauma, martyrdom, as far as the book of Acts is concerned, as far as contexts today are concerned, are often God's way of enabling his church to develop. I might have thought of a different way that didn't involve suffering, but we're talking about God, the God that we have been worshiping, the God who is worthy of our worship because he seems to know everything and get everything right first time, and he is the one who has decided that this is the path that he will ask us to go on sometimes as Christians. Suffering, be it persecution, be it poverty, be it pain, can keep us walking with Jesus. A couple of years ago, I was speaking at a symposium in South Korea. You may know the name David Yonggi Cho, pastor for a long time, the largest church in the world, and he has a symposium every year, and I have been asked to speak at it just for one day. And in the evening, we had a meal together. Pastor Cho, his wife, the pastor of the Yoido church that he established, and about 6 or 7 leaders of mega churches in South Korea and some theological college lecturers. And I asked them, after we'd had a meal, what's the biggest challenge facing you as Christians, leaders in Korea? And one young man sitting opposite me said immediately, here's our challenge. We have peaked in our church growth. We have peaked in our church growth. I sat back somewhat surprised because if you know South Korea, you will know that some of the biggest churches in the world are in South Korea. Pentecostal churches, Presbyterian churches, mega churches. They have huge emphasis on prayer, huge emphasis on evangelism. And here was this man telling me that they have peaked in their church growth. Surely not. Yes, the others agreed. I said, well, why? Because I come from the West and we peaked in our church growth so far ago I can't remember. We've been on the slide down for a long time. He said, here's our challenge. Our young Christians, our young people who are coming to know Jesus do not have the same commitment to certain traditional values and ethos that we had 30, 40, 50 years ago. Commitment to church attendance, commitment to study of the Bible, commitment to prayer, commitment to evangelism, commitment to those elements of being prepared to suffer for Jesus, even be disciplined in your own personal life. Because we're losing that, we're losing something of the depth of spirituality in our churches, and we are worried as to what this is going to do for generations to come. Suffering, whatever the form, can be valuable for us. Now let's be a little more specific and think about those occasions when we have prayed that God will end certain suffering in our lives that is very difficult for us to cope with. Sometimes God will say no. And it's not because we've done something wrong. It's not because he isn't compassionate. It's not because we haven't prayed enough. It's not because we don't have enough faith. We need to remove this idea that we have to bring a lot of faith to God before God does something for us, because that is completely unhelpful. God cares for you far more than you care for you. He is much more interested in me than I am interested in me, and he wants the best for me, but the best for me is maybe not what I think is the best for me. And when I ask him to help me, my guarantee is that he will help me. But he just might not help me in the way that I might anticipate. And sometimes the best way of helping us is to say, actually, Keith, no. Remember the Apostle Paul? I'm telling you things you know already. The Apostle Paul has a trauma. It is so difficult that he speaks of it as a thorn in his flesh. And that word that he uses is a particular barb. It's a very long thorn. It's almost hyperbolic that this thorn should be in his flesh. But that's how painful it is. We don't know what the problem is. In fact, Paul, I think, very sensitively doesn't tell us what the problem is. My best guess is that it's something physical. My best guess is that it's something associated with malaria, because we know he's got bad eyes because he mentions it a couple of times in the text, and it's quite likely that on the way on his second missionary journey, when he went into modern Turkey, crossed the coast, which was a malaria-infested swamp, to go and preach the gospel. And he can go no further because he is ill. How do I know? Galatians 4:13 tells me. In fact, it's quite interesting. It's probably not mentioned like this in your English translations, but it says something like this. Paul says, I'm glad that you didn't, the Greek word is spit at me. I'm glad that you didn't spit at me. Why would people want to spit at Paul? Because there's something physical about his appearance that makes people want to protect themselves from him, so they spit in his direction, so that curse that is clearly on him as manifested by this physical condition won't somehow rub off on them. So in their worldview, they think, to protect ourselves, we'll spit against you. Paul says, I'm glad you didn't. But the funny thing is, because of this condition, he can't travel on. He has to stay where he is. And what results from that? Churches are established in Lystra, Troas, Iconium, because God has used illness for the benefit of his kingdom. Not the devil. The devil didn't have the victory and God got around it. No, God takes advantage of everything that happens to us for his purposes, because he's much more sovereign than we might think he is. And sometimes we've got to stop listening to the publicity that the devil puts out, because he is not. He is a defeated foe. Yeah, he might be more powerful than me, but Jesus is by here. The Spirit is in me, and like it or not, whether we feel it or not, or know it or not, God is around us. So the devil is very defeated, and God is sovereign. So everything that happens to us happens as a result of God's sovereign involvement in our lives. Unless, of course, we're going to deliberately do something wrong, and then we should take the consequences of that. But sometimes, as with Paul, God says no. He asks him 3 times, doesn't he? Please, Lord, take it from me. And then by the time it's the 3rd time, he must be realizing this isn't going to happen. And then God says, no, you're right, it's not going to happen, but I am going to give you something, and I'm going to give you my grace. I'm going to give you that ability to cope with this that you have until you get to see me in the future. Sometimes God says no. I remember a young lady who joined our church when Judy and I were leaders of the church. Her name was Janice. She and her mum and dad came to faith in Jesus, and they were a lovely family. And Janice had a particular physical problem that resulted in her having had a kidney transplant. The body rejected it. She needed another one. But the trouble was that she couldn't have another one because there was too much calcium in her blood. To get rid of the calcium, you needed a new kidney. But you couldn't have a new kidney because there was too much calcium. So this was a real difficult situation. What we were going to do? Well, obviously, we knew what we were going to do. We were going to pray, and we did. We prayed, and we fasted, and we had nights of prayer, and we got other people to pray for Janice. Janice got worse. Boils appeared on her body. Her arm had to be amputated because the physical condition was so deteriorating. And we were at the end of our tether wondering, what should we do? Our assumption was that God would always heal if we asked him. That was our assumption. But then the thought came to me, maybe God wants to take Janice home. She wasn't 30 years of age yet. Why would God want to take Janice home to heaven? She hasn't lived her life. But the thought persisted in my mind, and I tried to suppress it because my tradition indicated that if I was going to think like that, then that was equivalent to doubt or lack of faith, and Janice would never get healed. So I suppressed it until, in the end, I thought, I need to talk to Judy. So it was a good thing to do, to talk to your partner. And Judy's feeling was, well, if this is continually coming to you, then maybe this is God's plan. So then we talked it through with our 2 leaders. They were younger Christians than me, and we felt that maybe this was God leading us because we had been asking him for guidance because Jan wasn't getting better. And then I felt I needed to talk to Jan, because if I was going to be authentic, I couldn't just keep praying that she would get better when in my heart I was feeling that God was saying I want to take her home. So I talked to Janice, went to her home, and I still remember it now, even though it was decades ago. And as I shared with her very gently that I wondered whether the possibility was that the Lord might want to take you home, Jan, she burst into tears, which is exactly what I didn't want to happen. Because I thought, I've blown it now. She's never going to trust me. And then when her tears subsided, she said, I'm so thankful that you shared that. Here's why. She thought it was her fault that she hadn't been healed. because she saw everybody else praying for her, doing everything they could to beg God to touch her. She still wasn't being healed. Her conclusion, she must have done something wrong. Big burden that we had unwittingly put on Janice. About 2 weeks later, Janice went to be with the Lord. And I remember on the morning of the funeral going to her home, and her mum, Jean, was there doing the ironing in the front room. I can see it now. And just in a few hours later, we would be celebrating, I use the word deliberately, celebrating Janice's young life, which it was. Because we had ushered Janice into the presence of the Lord. We hadn't lost her. We hadn't lost the battle. The devil hadn't won the victory. It hadn't been a defeat. God had graciously guided us so that we could prepare Janice for her next life, which apparently is supposed to be better than this life, although you'd never believe it after the Christians you talk to. That life, which is supposed to be wonderful, we had the opportunity to usher Janice into it, and we did it like this. Sometimes God will say no. And he knows why. And sometimes to ask the question, why God did you have Janice when she was 30 and not wait until she was 70? Sometimes that's not helpful, and sometimes it's better to pray and listen for guidance. One of my big mantras is that I have 2 ears. One of them is to hear the person that I'm praying for, and the other is to hear what the Lord might say. Because prayer, as you will know, is not us telling God what to do or advising God as to what he should do or reminding him that he should be doing this or telling him something that he doesn't know. Prayer is supposed to be a dialogue, and it's an opportunity for us to hear him guide us in our prayers. Because, of course, he knows the right prayer to pray, the best prayer to pray, and the prayer that is in keeping with his will. He knows what that prayer is. Sometimes we don't. And sometimes we just take stabs at it. And if we listened, we might be surprised to how God will guide us in our praying so that the prayer we pray gets tweaked into the prayer that he wants to be asked. And, of course, that prayer will be answered. But to claim it or thoughtlessly pray can be quite damaging to the person concerned and unhelpful and, may I suggest, displeasing to the Lord, who has already said he will help us in our prayers. And if we don't listen to him, then that's a bit rude. God sometimes says no. What else can we say about suffering? Well, suffering is God's way of helping us grow. I wish it was different. I wish that I could have an injection every Monday morning. As a result of that, I would grow through the week, and I would come back for the injection next Monday. But God says, well, I've got a different way, actually, to help you grow, and it's suffering. The first book of the New Testament to be written, which is the book of James, written by Jesus' half-brother, the leader of the Church of Jerusalem, the first thing he says in James, it's a bit like the first sermon I'm preaching to you is suffering. The first thing he says in the book of James is, suffering is good for you. For goodness sake, James, say something good to start the book off. No, that's the good thing. Suffering is good for you because it'll help you mature, it'll help you grow, it'll help you develop. And these were people who were suffering. He's not just offering a theological statement that they can tuck into their minds for the future. They were suffering oppression. They were suffering financial subjugation by rich people. They were also suffering persecution. And we know, because of what he says in chapter 5, that they were suffering physically as well. Whole ranges of suffering they were experiencing. And James's first statement is not, don't worry about it, God will take it away. Quite the contrary. He's saying suffering, let me tell you, is good for you. So be aware of that. If God does take it away, he's going to have to find something as good as suffering to help you grow. Sometimes suffering can be God's way of reminding us that something isn't quite right in our lives. The New Testament mentions this. Do you remember when Paul says about people who come to the Lord's Supper and they don't realize that they're not being very nice to people in the church community, and then they come to the Lord's table and they take it as if that didn't matter? And Paul says, well, actually it does matter, because if you're nasty to each other as Christians and then you come and participate in the Lord's table and participate in eating the bread, which is a symbol of the community, and you don't realize there is a connection, God's going to have to help you. And Paul says some of you are weak because of that. Some of you are sick because of that. Some of you have died because of that. Whoa, come on. Well, that's God's way of disciplining us. There's a very good book by an author called Philip Yancey. It's called Pain, the Gift Nobody Wants. Pain, the gift nobody wants. But it's God's gift to sometimes help us realize that something isn't right. I'm always aware of this when I'm being asked to pray for somebody who's physically ill, because there is always the possibility that that physical condition might be God's way of trying to draw attention to something in that person's life that needs to be resolved. I'm not going to assume that it is always personal sin, because Jesus never does in the Gospels, never does. But on the basis of what Paul says and what we got in the book of Acts and what we got in the book of James, I know that sometimes it's God's way of drawing attention to an issue in our lives that isn't quite right, and his way of doing it is to physically affect us. And if I pray that God will take that sickness away before that issue hasn't been dealt with, well, I can pray till the cows come home, but that will not be dealt with. But it will be dealt with if I'm hearing the Lord, and the Lord might say, well, something in this person's life needs to be repented of. Some relationship needs to be resolved. Let's get that sorted out, and then maybe we can address the physical condition later. I'm very sensitive in doing this, but I'm at least aware of the fact that sometimes suffering is there to draw attention to something in our lives that isn't right. I don't know about you, but I live a busy life. You live busy lives. You're already planning what you're doing on Monday, but that's because you're getting a bit fed up of me talking. But whatever, even if you were interested, you've still got a busy life. And sometimes we forget that this life, this little hiccup in the mind of God, is not what we have been created for. We've been created for eternity. And our suffering, and I'm not belittling suffering, and some of you here are in situations of suffering that I don't know whether I could handle. And you are handling them. And if you are in that situation, you need to remember that forces other than people are looking at you. And some of those forces are malignant, and some of them are angelic, but they're all getting the same message. How can these people exist in this traumatic situation and still trust God? How can they do it? Why haven't they turned against him? Why haven't they been like Job's wife and said, curse God for what he's bringing? How can they do it? And the message that you are given to people's groups outside of this terrestrial population is bringing pleasure to God, because you are showing to them your ability to trust God even though times are very difficult for you. Marshall Shelley, when he shared this information, was the executive editor of Leadership Journal and the editorial vice president of Christianity Today. He's a husband and a father of 5 children, 4 girls and 1 boy, 3 of whom are living on this earth. 2 of them are in heaven. Mandy was 2 weeks short of her 2nd birthday before she went to be with the Lord, having spent all her life unable to respond to her environment because she was so severely retarded. And 3 months earlier, Toby was born. And Toby lived for 2 minutes. They just had 1 minute each to hold Toby before he was born. 8:22 p.m. 8:24, Toby had gone. And Marshall Shelley and his wife went through some very dark times after Toby's death. And they struggled with the question, why? Why, God, would you allow someone to be born like our daughter Mandy, who lives just 2 years? Why would you allow somebody like Toby to live just 2 minutes? Why? This is what he says. The truth is, he didn't. This is what he concluded. God didn't create our daughter, Mandy, to live for 2 years. God didn't create our son, Toby, to live for 2 minutes. God created them for eternity. God created them for eternity. God did not create us for 2 years, for 10 years, for 70 years. I'm 63, let's say for 90 years. He created us for eternity. We've been created, we've been appointed, we've been destined, we've been programmed, we've been planned not for this life, We've been programmed for the life to come. And maybe it's in the life to come that some of our questions that we have concerning our suffering, or the sufferings of other people, or the sufferings that we have had in the past, maybe it's in the next life that we need to be asking why. Maybe in the next life we won't even need to ask the questions why, because the answer will be so obvious, because we'll have a recreated minds. But present suffering is to be explored if we do it in the knowledge of a better life that's coming, when there's no more sorrow. I just noticed the clock, which is ridiculous that it goes so fast down here in Reading. I think I'm just going to mention one more thing. But I was interested in what TJ is he here? Yes, he is. What he's doing the charity event for the hospice, because another significant reason why we suffer, Paul says this, is so that we can benefit others. God comforts us, says Paul in 2 Corinthians, so that the comfort which we have benefited from, we can share with others, and that they can benefit them. Suffering has that capacity to enable us to support others and to supply strength and resolve to them. But maybe my final point I want to say, and then I'm just going to talk about one verse and then we truly are done, is that suffering actually gives us the opportunity to reflect God and to encounter God better than anything else. Suffering is often the platform to serve God in a way that not to suffer wouldn't. I can think of another number of occasions where this has worked out in the Bible. I'm thinking John the Baptist. John the Baptist, fantastic life. God chooses him. He's going to precede the Messiah. He's going to precede Jesus, and he's chosen from birth, and it's a wonderful life. You spend a little time thinking about some of the difficulties that John the Baptist went through. His life was dominated by misunderstanding, by rejection. He himself doubted his own mission, doubted Messiah. Jesus, are you really the one who's supposed to come? Because I'm in prison, and from what I can hear, they're going to chop my head off, and you're still there. Why aren't you rescuing me? John the Baptist's life was victorious and successful, but the Spirit drew him to his destiny on a path of suffering. And even when he died, he was unaware of the success of the one that he preceded. Suffering can be God's way of better revealing himself through us. Just one final story. You may not know this name. His name is Donald Guthrie. When I was in college in London many years ago, he was one of my professors. He was a Christian. He was a fine man. And he had a stutter. When he was a young man, he was in Oxbridge studying law because he wanted to be a barrister, and because of his academic ability, I'm sure he would have been a brilliant barrister. But because of his stutter, he couldn't function in a legal context. And so he decided to change from law to do theology. And here I was as a student, 19 years of age, listening to this erudite man stammer and stutter through his lectures to me. And sometimes it was embarrassing for me to listen to him because it was such a serious impediment. But Donald Guthrie wrote 2 books. One was called New Testament Introduction. The other one was called New Testament Theology. And he wrote them at a time when all of these serious books on the theology of the New Testament and introduction to the New Testament were being written by liberal theologians, the kind of people that you would definitely not have preach here. But they were the ones, because of their academic, scholarly abilities, were writing these books, and they were undermining the credibility of the New Testament. Donald Guthrie was the one who said, so far, no further. And his books have been translated into I don't know how many languages and been produced in great thousands. God had graciously chosen to take this man with a vulnerability, a weakness, a suffering. He could have healed him in a minute. He could have functioned in a legal context perfectly well. He could have functioned as a theologian without the stammer. But it resulted in him having the opportunity to focus his destiny on his research, as a result of which he benefited the world of theology. A stutter forced him down a route that he had not planned, but God had designed. The last thing I want to mention to you is this, and it's taken from the book of Romans, and believe me, I will be I don't know whether to finish this sentence because then I restrict myself. In Romans chapter 8, this is a chapter that Paul refers to where he's speaking about the Spirit. And interestingly, for Paul, generally speaking, when he speaks about the Spirit, it's in terms of suffering, Christians who are vulnerable and weak. It's rarely in context where the dynamic, charismatic Christian is benefiting from the help of the Spirit. That does happen, but much more often, the Spirit is there to give his resources to Christians like you and me who are suffering. Not to take us out of our suffering necessarily, but to help us during our suffering and so that we can reflect God better in that time of suffering. This is what Paul says. Now listen, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. Now, what kind of weakness are we talking about? Well, Paul uses a Greek word which is asthenia, and astheneo is a whole range of weaknesses. Whatever kind of weakness you can think of, that word has the capacity to refer to it. And Paul doesn't specify what weakness he's talking about. In fact, I suspect that Paul is speaking about not just a weakness that we feel when we're at the end of our tether, but he's probably speaking also about those times when everything is going fine, but even then, we're human, we're dust, we're vulnerable, we're fragile. And on the top of the mountain or at the bottom of the mountain or anywhere in between, the Spirit has destined himself to help us, to support us in our weakness. But before I move to the rest of the verse, I just need to pause and remind you or help you know what he means by help. Because help is a very bland term. The Spirit helps us. Well, Paul doesn't want bland, and so Paul, because he's a teacher, decides to make up a word. And you can do this in Greek, like you can do it in some other languages, modern languages. And so he takes a word which is lambano, and then he puts another word on the front, and then he puts another word on the front. Now, the reason he's doing that is because he wants to elevate the significance of the help that the Spirit offers. This is not help from a distance. This is not help once in a blue moon. This is not help when we're begging God to help us. This is the Spirit unilaterally deciding that he will superabundantly help us in our weaknesses. What kind of weakness? When we're about to commit suicide? No, for goodness sake. The Spirit knows that you are weak even when you don't know you're weak. And his commitment is to constantly be invading your life with his superabundant power. And then Paul gives us an example, and here I am coming to a close. He said, let me give you an example. When you don't know what to pray for, you are just so much at the end of your tether, you can't even put your prayers into words. You maybe can articulate a groan, but that's it. It's okay, don't worry. Because the Spirit has taken it upon himself to pray for you. Paul is not saying that the Spirit helps us to pray. Not here. He's actually saying when you can't pray, the Spirit chooses to pray on your behalf. What's the picture that's going on there? The picture that's going on there is this, that the Father and the Son and the Spirit are dedicated to us. Salvation is about us. Shouldn't be. It's too good to be true. Far too remarkable that God should invest in us his grace and give to us salvation. But the Spirit, who is the face of God in our lives, because he's come to live within us from the moment we become Christians, the Spirit says, listen, it's okay. I know you're really struggling, but I'm praying for you. Now, he's not telling the Father something the Father doesn't know. He's not reminding the Father to wake up. For goodness sake, come and help this bloke. The Spirit is God. But the picture is that the Spirit and the Father and the Son, in their conversations, you will be surprised how often you are being mentioned. Really? I haven't done much. No. You're forgetting why they are remembering you. It's because you're a child of God. It's because you're a daughter of God. It's because you're a son of God. It's because you're weak. It's because you're fragile. Because you think that you are even less significant than you are. So what I got to let you know is what's going on in heaven. Because I'll tell you what's not going on in heaven. There is no running around in heaven, the angels trying to cope with the devil. Absolutely not. What's going on in heaven is what's going to go on in eternity. The Godhead is engaged with the church. But in heaven, when we're all there, it's going to be visible. But Paul says right now it's not visible. So I need to tell you, the Spirit is on your side. He's praying for you. Well, that's a good place for us to finish. And so I will do that, but I will pray for you just as I do. Father, I'm aware that there will be people here today who are suffering a range of experiences, and some of that suffering will have been part of their lives for some time. And looks as if it'll be part of their lives for a little while to come as well. Whereas there are some of us who are not experiencing a great deal of suffering. And so my prayer, Lord, is that, Spirit, you will be our partner and help us to recognize your presence in our lives, in whatever situation we find ourselves in. I thank you that I don't need to ask you to do anything for us because you are already committed to doing that. But what I would ask is that you will help us realize the truth of that. And perhaps, if you would be so kind, you might surprise us with your presence by giving us a fresh injection of hope or peace or joy. And that will signal to us that we're not on our own. Our response, Lord, in all of this is to thank you for encompassing us with yourself. And you are not just great, but you are ours. And we love you very much. Amen.